The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad day because Tuesdays were when their mother held her weekly tea, which meant Mabel was expected to sit in the corner and not embarrass anyone. She almost missed it entirely. The envelope had been tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the dry goods store, and it was addressed in a hand she didn't recognize. Blocky, deliberate letters, the penmanship of a man who wrote infrequently and took it seriously when he did. The return address read, C. Granger, Linden Creek, Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. Mabel stood in the front hallway of the Whitmore house in Hatchet Falls, Ohio, holding this envelope, and felt the particular stillness that sometimes arrives before something irreversible. She knew, before she opened it, that her sisters had done something. She could have gone upstairs and confronted them. She could have thrown the letter in the grate without reading it. She could have done a dozen sensible, dignified things. Instead, she carried it to the kitchen, sat down at the table where the cook wasn't yet in for the morning, and opened it herself. Dear Miss Whitmore, I'll be straight with you because I don't have much use for anything else. I'm a rancher, 41 years old, a widower with a son of 8 named Thomas. I have roughly 600 acres of working land outside Linden Creek and a house that hasn't had a woman's touch in 4 years. I'm not a romantic man. I don't know how to be charming, and I don't intend to learn. What I can offer is honest work, a fair wage for running a household, my respect, and a share in whatever this ranch becomes. I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for a partner. If that doesn't interest you, I understand. If it does, write back. Caleb Granger. Mabel read it twice. She was still reading it when her sister Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown, reaching past her for the coffee pot, and then stopped dead when she saw the envelope on the table. Dora's face did several things in quick succession. Surprise, amusement, something that wasn't quite guilt, but was close enough to it. You actually got it, Dora said. Obviously, I got it. Mabel set the letter down carefully. How long ago did you send my name? Dora leaned against the counter, crossing her arms, affecting a breezy indifference that she'd been practicing since childhood. She was 2 years younger than Mabel, and prettier in the way their mother called conventional, which meant she had the kind of face that didn't make people look away. 3 weeks, maybe. We found the advertisement in Father's newspaper. Clara thought it would be funny. Did you? We didn't think he'd actually respond. She paused. We described you accurately, Mabel. It's not like we lied. You described me, Mabel said very quietly, to a stranger, without my knowledge, as a joke. Dora had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. Well, now you can write back and tell him there's been a mistake. No harm done. Mabel looked at the letter again, at the handwriting, at the plain, unadorned directness of it. I'm not asking for love, I'm asking for a partner. She folded it carefully and slid it into her apron pocket. You're right, she said. No harm done. She stood up, refilled the coffee pot, and began her morning routine, and Dora wandered off, satisfied, and that was the end of it, as far as Dora was concerned. Mabel wrote back that afternoon. She sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom, the one facing the window that overlooked the garden, the one she'd had since she was 12, and she wrote the most honest letter she had ever composed in her life. She told him she was 29. She told him she was the sort of woman who got overlooked at parties and managed households well and had never been west of Pennsylvania. She told him she was not beautiful in any fashionable sense, and that if he had received a description of her appearance, she imagined it was accurate. She told him she could keep books, manage a larder, handle difficult people with a reasonable degree of composure, and that she had no particular fear of hard work, though she had not yet tested that against anything harder than an Ohio winter. She told him she had no illusions about romance. She told him she was interested. She did not tell him how her hand shook while she sealed the envelope. His second letter came in 11 days, which was fast enough that he must have written it within a day of receiving hers. Miss Whitmore, come in April if you're willing. Thomas is asking questions I don't know how to answer about why there's no woman in the house. Train to Rollins, then the stage to Linden Creek. I'll meet you at the depot. C. Granger. She told her mother at dinner. The silence that followed was the particular Whitmore family silence that preceded an argument, very still, very loaded, the way air goes quiet before a storm rolls in. You cannot be serious, her mother said finally. I am. Mabel, her mother set down her fork. She was a handsome woman, their mother, a woman who had married well and expected her daughters to do the same, and who had spent 2 decades quietly filing Mabel away as the daughter who was going to require creative management. Wyoming is barely a territory. It's rough country. There's nothing out there but cattle and criminals. And apparently a rancher who needs a partner. Mabel reached for the bread. I accepted his proposal. Clara, her younger sister, laughed before catching herself. You actually want to go? I want to leave, Mabel said plainly. Going somewhere interesting seems like the better option. You'll be miserable. Her mother's voice had gone to its controlled register, the one that meant she was choosing her words for effect. You have no idea what that kind of life is like. No society, no culture, no refinement, and a man who places advertisements for brides is, well, he's not the sort of man who... Who what? Mabel asked. Who would want me otherwise? The table went quiet. Her mother did not answer, which was itself an answer. Mabel finished her bread. She gave herself 3 weeks to prepare and spent most of them being practical. She bought wool, sensible wool, the kind her mother called unfortunate and Mabel called warm. She bought a sturdy pair of boots, a half size too large because she'd read that feet swell in cold weather. She bought a medical handbook, a book on cattle ranching she found at the back of a second-hand bookshop, and a slim volume on Wyoming Territory geography that was already 6 years out of date, but still better than nothing. She did not buy anything decorative. She did not buy anything with lace. She did not buy the kind of outfit that said, I am trying to impress someone, because she had decided very deliberately that she was done trying to impress people who hadn't earned her effort. On the last night before her departure, Clara came to her room. Clara was the prettiest of the Whitmore sisters, and she knew it in the careless way beautiful people often know things. Not cruelly exactly, but without much attention to the weight of it. She stood in the doorway of Mabel's room, watching her fold a wool skirt into the trunk, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. I'm sorry, Clara said finally. About the letter. About sending it. Mabel looked at her. It was meant to be funny. Clara picked at the doorframe. We didn't think we thought it would just be embarrassing, that you'd get a letter that you weren't expecting and it would be awkward and then nothing would come of it, and maybe you'd be a little humiliated and... She stopped. I don't know what we thought, actually. That's not an excuse. No, Mabel agreed. It isn't. Are you angry? Mabel considered this honestly. I was. I think I'm mostly just tired. She folded another skirt. But here's what I keep thinking, Clara. You sent that letter because you thought the idea of someone choosing me was funny. And now I'm leaving, and you're staying. And I don't know if that's punishment or just... She shrugged. Life's sorting itself out. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were wet, which surprised Mabel a little. What if he's awful? Clara asked. He might be. Mabel latched the trunk. People usually are, a little. I'll manage. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her childhood bed and looked at the ceiling. She'd looked at for 29 years and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement exactly, and not fear exactly, but something that sat between the two and moved in her chest like a bird that hadn't yet decided whether to fly. She thought about Caleb Granger's handwriting, the deliberateness of it. She thought about, I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for a partner. She thought that was either the most honest thing a man had ever said to her or the saddest, possibly both. Her mother did not come to the station. She said she had a headache, which was the Whitmore family way of saying, I disapprove so strongly, I cannot participate. Mabel had expected this and had already decided she wasn't going to spend any of her remaining Ohio hours being sad about it. Dora came, unexpectedly, and stood on the platform in her good coat and said nothing useful but also nothing cruel, which Mabel decided to count as a kind of progress. Clara came and hugged her so hard that Mabel's hat was nearly knocked sideways, and held on longer than was fashionable, and whispered, "Write to me," against her shoulder. "I'll write," Mabel said. The conductor called for boarding. Mabel picked up her travel bag. The trunk had already been loaded. and she walked to the train, and she did not let herself look back, because she had learned a long time ago that looking back at things you'd already decided to leave was a particular kind of self-cruelty that served no useful purpose. She found her seat. She settled her bag above her. She looked out the window at the Hatchet Falls station, at the platform, at Dora standing very straight, and Clara with her hand raised in a wave that looked more like reaching than farewell. The train lurched. The station began to move away. Mabel Whitmore pressed her palm against the cold glass and breathed, slow and deliberate, and let Ohio go. 3 days on a train is long enough to do a great deal of thinking. She watched the country change outside the window. The familiar Ohio fields giving way to Indiana flatlands, then Illinois, then the wide brown nothing of the Missouri prairie that went on longer than she had thought any landscape could sustain itself. She read her cattle ranching book until she had absorbed enough to hold a basic conversation about it. She ate in the dining car at off-peak hours when it was less crowded and she was less likely to have to endure the particular discomfort of strangers looking at her and then looking away. She'd spent most of her life navigating around that discomfort, the sideways glances, the way people adjusted their expressions when they saw her, making tiny involuntary recalibrations between what they'd expected and what they got. She'd learned to move through it with a kind of practiced invisibility, keeping herself small and quiet and unobtrusive, taking up as little social space as possible. She thought about that, on the train, about all the years of making herself smaller than she was. She took up the window seat. She put her elbows on the armrests. She ordered the full dinner instead of just the soup. Small rebellions, but they felt like something. What? There was a woman 2 rows ahead of her, traveling alone as well, a widow in her late 40s with a sharp face and a sharper manner who introduced herself, unprompted, as Mrs. Ruth Haverford of Cincinnati. Heading west? Ruth asked, which was an obvious question given they were all heading west on a westbound train, but Mabel understood it as social overture and answered it accordingly. Wyoming Territory, Linden Creek. Ruth raised her eyebrows. By yourself? I'm meeting someone there. Husband? Will be. Mabel folded her hands in her lap. Essentially. Ruth looked at her with the frank appraisal of a woman who had stopped caring what people thought of her looking. Mail order? Yes. Ruth nodded, unsurprised. My cousin did that. Colorado, 7 years ago. Married a minor. She paused. It didn't work out. Did she leave? He did. Took off with a woman from the camp. Ruth looked out the window. She stayed, though. Runs a boarding house now. Seems happy enough. Mabel considered this. What was her name? Harriet. Harriet from Colorado who runs a boarding house sounds like someone who figured things out. Ruth laughed, a short, surprised sound. You know, I suppose she did. She looked at Mabel with a slight shift in her expression, something warming. What's your name? Mabel Whitmore. Ruth Haverford. She extended her hand across the seat back, and Mabel shook it. Are you frightened? Mabel thought about this honestly. I think I'm more frightened of going back than going forward. Ruth nodded slowly. That's probably the right kind of frightened to be. She arrived in Rawlins on a Thursday afternoon in early April, when the air smelled like cold earth and something she couldn't identify, but later learned was sage. The stage to Linden Creek left at first light the next morning, which meant a night at the depot town's one hotel, a narrow building with a sign in the window that said rooms, 75 cents, and a proprietress who looked at Mabel with neither curiosity nor judgment and simply showed her to a small, clean room with a window overlooking a dirt street. Mabel washed her face and sat on the edge of the bed and was, for approximately 4 minutes, completely overwhelmed. She'd held herself together for 3 days on the train through sheer willpower and the numbing effect of movement. Now that she'd stopped moving, everything she hadn't let herself feel came in at once. The fear, the absurdity of what she'd done, the image of her mother's face when she'd said Wyoming, the way Clara had held on at the station. She sat with it. She let it move through her. She didn't cry, which she considered a minor victory, though she came close enough that it took some effort. Then she washed her face again with cold water. She hung up her traveling dress so it would air out overnight. She ate the supper the hotel included in the room price, which was bean soup and bread, and better than expected. She went to bed early. She told herself she'd be fine. She didn't entirely believe it. She went to sleep anyway. Whoa. The stage deposited her in Linden Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon, which meant she arrived squinting into a pale April sun, road dust on her coat, her hair in a state that no amount of attention during the journey had managed to improve, carrying her travel bag and feeling, frankly, a wreck. Linden Creek was smaller than she'd imagined and larger than the word outpost suggested. A main street maybe 3 blocks long, a general store, a feed and grain, a saloon with its doors open despite the hour, a small schoolhouse at the far end. The buildings were mostly raw wood, unpainted, weathered in the particular way of structures that endure seasons without apology. There were maybe a dozen people visible, and most of them looked at her with the frank curiosity of people in small places who don't see new arrivals often enough to pretend they don't notice them. She looked up and down the street. A man was standing by a wagon near the depot, and he was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance. Not warm, exactly. Not cold, either. Just steady. He was tall, leaner than she'd expected for a man who worked cattle, with the look of someone who had been weathered by something more than just weather. He wore a brown hat she'd learned was his working hat, the crown creased in a way he'd long stopped bothering to correct. He did not come to her immediately. He waited while she collected herself, which she suspected was intentional. When he crossed the street toward her, she noticed he walked with a very slight unevenness in his right leg. Nothing dramatic, just a barely perceptible catch in his stride that she'd later learn was from a fence post accident 4 years ago. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Not a question. He'd recognized her from her description, which meant he'd read her letter more than once, which meant something she wasn't yet sure how to interpret. "Mr. Granger." She extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm without performing firmness, which she respected immediately. Up close, he was older looking than 41 in the way men who work outdoors often are, but there was a directness in his face that matched his letters. He looked at her like he was seeing her, not comparing her to something else. "Trunk?" he asked. "The stage has it." He went to collect it. She stood by the wagon and breathed Wyoming air and thought, "All right, here we are then." That. The ride to Granger Ranch was 40 minutes by wagon, and it was not comfortable because the road was more suggestion than fact, and the wagon springs were, as best she could tell, decorative. Caleb drove with the silence of a man who considered silence a reasonable default setting. Mabel, who had spent 3 days on a train working herself up to this conversation, found herself also saying nothing for the first 10 minutes, which she told herself was fine. Then she said, "How long has your son been without a woman in the house?" Caleb glanced at her sideways. 4 years, since his mother passed. "What was her name?" A pause. "Eleanor." "I'm sorry." He looked at the road. It was hard. It was the kind of understatement that holds a great deal of weight inside very few words. Mabel recognized it because she'd used similar understatements about her own life. She did not press it. "What does Thomas know?" she asked instead. "About me coming." "That I wrote to a woman in Ohio and she agreed to come out and marry me and be here for him." Caleb turned the wagon onto a narrower track between 2 fence lines. "I didn't tell him more than that." "Did he ask?" "He asked if you were nice." A slight thing happened to the corner of Caleb's mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I told him I'd let him decide." "And what will you decide?" she asked, because she'd already decided not to dance around things with this man. He considered it, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for a flattering answer, just thought about it honestly. "I'll decide the same way," he said, "by watching." "That's fair," she said. "I'll do the same." He glanced at her again, that same sideways look. Something shifted slightly in his expression, some small recalibration. "Fair enough," he said. The house was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow still a small shock. It was large by frontier standards, 2 stories, real glass windows, a porch that ran the front length, but it had the particular worn quality of a space that had been maintained without being tended to. Functional, but joyless. The kind of place that had stopped noticing itself. A boy appeared in the doorway before the wagon had fully stopped. Thomas Granger was 8 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark eyes in a face that was still soft with childhood. He stood on the porch, with an intensity that reminded Mabel of a cat deciding whether to run or stay. She climbed down from the wagon, without assistance because she'd learned not to wait for assistance she might not receive, and walked to the porch steps. "You must be Thomas," she said. "You're bigger than I thought," he said. Behind her, she heard Caleb say, quietly and sharply, "Thomas." "It's all right," Mabel said. She looked at the boy. "You're smaller than I thought?" Thomas blinked. Then something happened on his face, something that was working toward a grin even while he was trying to suppress it. "Pa says you're from Ohio," he said. "I am." "What's Ohio like?" "Flatter," she said, "and considerably less interesting than Wyoming, from what I've seen so far." He considered this. "You can come in," he decided, and held the door open with the gravity of a small person who has appointed himself in charge of something important. Mabel went in. Os. The kitchen was where she started because it was the room that told her the most. The cast-iron stove was good quality and clearly well used. The larder had staples: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, canned goods from the general store, but no system, just accumulated supplies that someone had been raiding at need. There was a coffee pot that had been cleaned recently. There was a pan that had not. She did not comment on any of this. She simply looked. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her take inventory. He had the wary stillness of a man waiting to be criticized. "I'll need to know what you grow versus what you purchase," she said, "and what the hands eat, and whether Thomas has any particular, she paused, dislikes. Children usually do." "He won't eat beans unless they're cooked with molasses," Caleb said. "That's reasonable." She turned to face him. "I'd like to walk the ranch tomorrow, if that's agreeable. Not all of it. I know there's a great deal, but enough to understand the layout." He nodded. "And I'd like to see the books." Something shifted in his expression. "The books." "The accounts, ranch finances." She held his gaze. "I keep books. I'd like to understand what I'm working with." A pause. He was measuring her. She could feel it, looking for something she couldn't quite identify, maybe the angle, maybe what she wanted from it. "I'll show you Sunday," he said finally, "after we're married." The word landed in the kitchen between them, neither of them quite looking at it directly. "Sunday's the ceremony?" she asked. "Judge Alderman comes through every other week. Sunday's the day." He paused. "If you're still willing." She'd had 3 days on a train to decide if she was still willing. She'd had 40 minutes in a wagon. She'd had the letter about a partner, not love. She'd had Thomas at the door saying, "You're bigger than I thought," and her own answer coming out of her mouth before she'd thought about it. She was, she realized, still willing. "Sunday's fine," she said. "Petit." That first night she slept in the small room off the kitchen that had apparently been used for storage, which she did not remark on because she understood the awkwardness of the arrangement and had expected something like it. The room smelled like dust and dried herbs and someone's old boots. She made up the narrow bed with blankets from her trunk and lay down in her clothes because the air was still sharp with night cold. She listened to the ranch settle around her, the particular creaks and groans of a wooden house contracting in the cold, the distant sound of cattle, something moving in the yard that turned out to be a dog she hadn't yet met. She was 3,800 miles from Ohio. She was in a stranger's house. She was going to marry a man she'd spent 40 minutes in a wagon with and shaken hands with once, and whose only correspondence she could recite from memory because she'd read both letters so many times. She was, she thought, completely out of her mind. She closed her eyes. She slept. She heard Thomas before she saw him the next morning, his footsteps overhead, then on the stairs, then the sound of him stopping outside the kitchen door. A pause. Then a knock, which surprised her. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame in his nightshirt with his dark hair still disordered from sleep, and he was holding something. "Pa makes oatmeal," he said, "but he burns it." She looked at what he was holding, a pot, and in his other hand a tin of oats. "Does he?" she said. "Every time." He came in and set both on the work table with the careful intention of a child who has been told not to slam things. He doesn't do it on purpose, he just forgets to watch it. "Well," Mabel said and stood up, "let's see if we can do better." She made oatmeal with molasses, because she'd remembered what Caleb said. And when Thomas ate 2 bowls without prompting, she counted that as the first small victory of her life in Wyoming and let herself have it. The wedding took 4 minutes. Judge Alderman was a compact, efficient man who had performed enough frontier marriages to have reduced the ceremony to its absolute minimum. The vows, the signatures, the handshake with the groom, the nod to the bride. He arrived at Granger Ranch on Sunday morning in a buggy that looked held together largely by optimism, conducted the ceremony in the front room with Thomas standing beside his father and 2 ranch hands named Pete Dalloway and Cobb serving as witnesses, and was back in his buggy and headed toward his next appointment before the coffee Mabel had made had finished cooling. She stood in the front room after he left, holding the marriage certificate, which was a single page of official-looking paper with a territorial seal in the corner, and thought, well, that's done then. Caleb was already pulling on his coat. Fence line on the north pasture needs checking before the temperature drops. I'll be back before supper. She looked at him. Today? He paused with one arm in his coat, and she saw on his face the brief expression of a man who had suddenly registered that this might not be standard behavior. The fence will still need checking tomorrow, she said. Not sharply, just as a statement of fact. Another pause. He finished putting on the coat, and for a moment she thought he was going to walk out anyway, and she was already cataloging how she'd respond to that when he stopped at the door. I'll go after dinner, he said. That's fine, she said. Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child who understands that adult conversations have layers he can't quite access yet, looked between them and then at Mabel. Does that mean you're staying? He asked. Thomas, Caleb started. I'm staying, Mabel said. The boy's face did something she couldn't entirely read, relief maybe, or something that was working toward it. He went back to the book he'd left on the table, and that was that. And Mabel went to the kitchen to start dinner for a family that was technically and legally and in every sense that would matter going forward, now hers. The first week taught her things no letter or cattle ranching book could have. The ranch hands, Pete, Cobb, and a younger man called Ira, who was maybe 17 and spoke in short bursts when he spoke at all, lived in the bunkhouse 20 yards from the main house. They had been, she quickly understood, operating on a rotation of self-sufficiency since Eleanor Granger's death, taking their meals there, managing their own laundry, and interacting with the main house primarily through Caleb's work orders. They were cautious around her in the way of men who are accustomed to their arrangements and don't trust changes to them. Pete was the oldest and most plain-spoken. On her third morning, when she brought coffee out to the bunkhouse without asking anyone if she should, he looked at the pot and then at her and said, Didn't expect that. It's cold, she said. Coffee seems reasonable. He took a cup. He said, which she decided to interpret as positive. Cobb said nothing but drank 3 cups. Ira looked at the ground and said, Thank you, ma'am. So quietly, she almost didn't catch it. She did not push for more than that. She understood she had to be earned. The house itself was the larger project. It was not dirty, exactly. Caleb kept it functional. But it had the particular neglect of a space where no one had any investment in it beyond its utility. Curtains that had gone gray. A parlor that no one sat in. A bedroom she was not yet occupying that she suspected had not been significantly altered since Eleanor died, which felt like a grief still too present to be disturbed. She started in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she had standing. She organized the larder with a system. Staples on the left, preserved goods in the middle, the things used daily within arm's reach of the stove. She found, in a box under the work table, a set of decent pots that had been displaced by no logic she could identify, and restored them to use. She fixed the latch on the back door that caught wrong and had been requiring a hip check to close properly, using a screwdriver she found in Caleb's toolbox after asking permission first. You fix things? Caleb asked, watching her work the latch. I fix what I know how to fix. She tightened the screw, tested the door. It closed clean. My mother's house had a handyman who came quarterly. That's a long time to wait for a sticking latch. He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor used to leave a list, he said. Things that needed fixing. I'd get to them eventually. I can do a list too, she said, or I can just fix the ones I'm able to. Well, either way, he said, and left it there. She fixed the latch. She added the parlor window that didn't sit quite right in its frame to her mental inventory of the house's complaints. She moved on. Thomas was the part of this arrangement she thought about most carefully. He was a watchful child, the kind who processed things quietly and came out with observations at unexpected moments. He was doing reasonably at school. She asked to see his lessons on the second day, which surprised him, and he was competent at the chores Caleb had assigned him, carrying them out with the focused efficiency of a child who understood that the work was real. What he was not doing was talking much. She didn't push that either. She had learned from years of being someone people talked around rather than to that the best thing you can do for a quiet person is give them something worth talking about. She started reading aloud after supper. She'd brought 2 novels in her trunk, one she hadn't read yet, one she'd read twice, and she began the unread one at the kitchen table on the 4th evening, just reading it to herself out loud, not making it an invitation, just doing it. She was 3 pages in when she heard Thomas's chair scrape around the table toward her. She kept reading. He put his chin on his hand and listened. She did not acknowledge the victory, because acknowledging it would have ended it. Caleb, who had been going over some papers at the far end of the table, set them down at page 6 and didn't pick them up again. She read for an hour. She stopped at a chapter break and Thomas said, "What happens next?" with the slightly indignant tone of a child who has been interrupted mid-thought. "Tomorrow night," she said. "That's not fair." "That's how it works." She closed the book. "You'll think about it all day, and it'll mean more when we get there." He grumbled, but she caught the particular shape of his face as he took his lamp upstairs, and it was better than the face he'd come to the table with. That was something. 3 weeks in, she asked to see the accounts. Caleb had said Sunday. He'd said after they were married. It was now more than 2 Sundays after they were married, and the books had not been produced, and Mabel had begun to wonder whether this was oversight or avoidance. She asked him directly on a Tuesday evening, same as the day she'd first received his letter, and she thought there might be some symmetry in that. "You mentioned the books," she said. "I'd like to look at them." He was at the table with his coffee, and he didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression had the particular flatness of a man who is deciding what to tell the truth about. "They're in the study," he said. "I'll get them." What he brought her was a ledger, a box of receipts in something that was adjacent to alphabetical order, and a second ledger that turned out to be the one Eleanor had kept, which was organized and clear up to the month she died, and then simply stopped. Mabel sat with these for an hour while Caleb did not leave the room, but also did not hover, instead occupying himself at the far end of the study in the way of a man who wants to pretend he isn't waiting for a verdict. The ranch was not failing. That was the first thing she established. The cattle operation was sound. Caleb clearly knew animals and land in a way that didn't require ledgers, but the finances were managed with the particular haphazard quality of a man who is good at his work and bad at the paperwork surrounding it, and there were gaps she could see clearly. Winter supply purchases at prices that were higher than they needed to be because he was buying in small lots at the last minute instead of planning ahead. A note at the local bank at interest she thought could be renegotiated. A pattern in the cattle sale records that suggested he was selling at the wrong point in the season, consistently, by about 3 to 4 weeks. She wrote this down on a piece of paper. Then she sat with it for a moment, thinking about how to present it. She'd been around men who didn't take observation well, especially from women, especially about finances. Her father had been one. She'd watched her mother's careful diplomacy around it her whole life, the way her mother softened her intelligence into suggestions, made her observations sound like questions, never quite said the things she actually thought. She decided she wasn't going to do that. "The note at Alderman's Bank," she said. "The interest rate. Is it negotiable?" Caleb looked up. "I don't know." "It should be. You've been servicing it consistently for 3 years." She turned the ledger so he could see the page. "And if you moved your fall sale back 3 to 4 weeks, look at the price difference." She showed him the pattern she'd found. "That's consistent across 4 years. End of October rather than early October." He came to the table. He looked at what she'd marked. "That's when Crow buys," he said after a moment. "Who?" "Harlan Crow. He has the biggest operation in the territory. When he sells, the price drops because everyone sells at the same time." Caleb's expression had gone still in a way she was starting to recognize as him thinking hard about something he hadn't thought about before. You wait until after, Crow, you get a better price. But he sells early. He always has. A pause. I never looked at it that way. You were busy looking at cattle, she said. That's fair. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. Then he said, What else? She showed him the supply purchasing pattern. She showed him the note. She did not do it as a lecture. She'd spent enough years being talked down to herself to know what that felt like. But plainly, as one person showing another person something they'd found that was useful. Here, look. This might matter. By the end of the hour, they'd made a plan for fall sales timing, a list of winter supplies to start pricing now, and a decision to speak with the bank in the next 2 weeks. When she closed the ledger, Caleb was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite respect. She didn't think he'd withhold respect exactly, but something more specific than that. Recognition, maybe. Like he was seeing an aspect of a thing he'd had partial information about and was now getting the fuller picture. You weren't exaggerating, he said. About the books. I told you I kept books. People say things. I know, she said. I also do things. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see where the smile would have been. The trouble with Harlan Crow started before she fully understood who Harlan Crow was. She heard the name first from Pete Dalloway, who mentioned it in passing when she was bringing the noon meal out to the south pasture where the hands were working a fence repair. Crow's man was in town again, Pete said, to Cobb, not to her, in the way of men who speak freely around women they've decided aren't listening. Which one? Cobb asked. Fuller, the one with the scar. Pete wiped his hands on his pants. Just watching is all. He does that. Mabel set down the meal basket and said, Who's Crow's man watching? Pete looked at her sideways, recalibrating. Mostly Grangerland, he said, after a pause. Why? Another pause, longer. Pete and Cobb exchanged the look of men who are deciding how much to tell someone they haven't fully evaluated yet. She waited. Crow wants this land, Pete said finally. Has for years. He's got most of the North County, and he wants the valley section that Granger sits on. Better water access than anything he's got. He picked up his meal. He's been waiting for Caleb to hit a bad enough year. That night at supper, she asked Caleb about Harlan Crow. He took his time answering, which she had learned meant the answer was either complicated or uncomfortable. He owns the Crow Western Cattle Company, he said finally, about 8,000 acres north of here. He's been trying to buy this ranch for 6 years. Trying to buy or trying to acquire? Caleb looked at her. What's the difference? Buying means he offers you money. Acquiring means he waits until you can't say no. A beat. Thomas was eating his beans with the focused attention of a child who has learned that supper table conversations between adults often contain more information if you don't appear to be listening. He's made offers, Caleb said. They were low. And if you had a bad year? They'd get lower. He pushed food around his plate. Last winter was hard. I had losses. He knew about them before I'd finished counting them, which tells you something about how he gets his information. Fuller, she said. The man with the scar. Caleb's eyes sharpened slightly. Pete told you. Pete mentioned him. She set down her fork. Does Crow have any legitimate claim on the land, any disputed title or water right? No. The word was flat and certain. This land was my father's. Title is clear. Then he's waiting for financial pressure. That's my read. All right, she said. Then we don't give him any. Caleb looked at her across the table with that measuring look that she was getting more familiar with, the one where he was checking whether she meant what she said. She did. She met Harlan Crow for the first time 6 weeks into her life at Granger Ranch, which was not her choosing. He came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon in May with no prior notice, and one of his men, who was not Fuller with the scar, but a younger, quieter type, who stood 2 steps back and said nothing. Mabel was in the yard hanging laundry when they rode in, and she watched the man dismount with the ease of someone who expected the world to accommodate his arrival. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a broad face and the particular manner of a man who had been successful long enough that he'd stopped remembering there had been a time when he wasn't. He looked around the yard until his gaze landed on her. She looked back at him without adjusting her expression. "Mrs. Granger?" he said with a sort of practiced pleasantness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes." "Harlan Crow." He tipped his hat, which was a good hat, the kind of hat that cost something. "Is your husband available?" "He's working the east pasture." She kept her hands on the sheet she'd been pinning. "Was he expecting you?" "I thought I'd stop by." He smiled, and it was a practiced smile, competent. "I'd heard Caleb had taken a wife. Wanted to offer my congratulations." "That's kind," she said, in a tone that gave him nothing. He looked at her for a moment. People often did this when they met her, ran a quick assessment, filed her somewhere. She watched him file her and saw, without particular surprise, that he filed her as unimportant. "I'll wait for him, if that's all right," Crow said. "You're welcome to wait on the porch," she said. "I can bring coffee." She brought him coffee and nothing else. No conversation, no information, no opening. She went back to the laundry. He sat on the porch with his man and waited, and she could feel his gaze on her back, but she did not turn around. When Caleb came in from the east pasture 40 minutes later, she watched from the yard as the two men spoke on the porch. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language well enough. Crow expansive and easy, Caleb contained and still, neither of them giving much. When Crow left, Caleb came across the yard to where she was collecting the dried laundry. "What did he say?" Caleb asked. "He said he was offering congratulations." She folded a shirt. "What did he say to you?" "That he's heard I had a rough winter, that his offer on the land was still open." A pause. "He made it sound like a favor." "Of course he did." She stacked the folded laundry in the basket. "What did you say?" "That the land wasn't for sale." "Good." She picked up the basket. "He'll be back." "He always comes back." "Then we'll be ready each time." She headed for the house and then stopped and looked back at him. "He didn't take me seriously at all. He looked right at me and saw furniture." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "I noticed." "That's useful," she said. "People who don't take you seriously don't watch what you do." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "You're already thinking about this," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "I'm always thinking," she said. "I've just mostly had to do it quietly." Bien, okay. June arrived with the particular cruelty of high-altitude summer, warm by midday, cold again by dusk, the light lasting almost uncomfortably long. Mabel had begun to adjust to the rhythms of the ranch in the way of someone who learns a new language, not by studying it, but by living inside it until the patterns become natural. She learned the sounds of the house at night, which creak was the roof settling, which was the wind against the north wall, which was Thomas getting up for water. She learned that the milk cow, a placid brown animal the hands had never bothered to name, was more predictable in her moods than most people. She learned that Ira, the young hand who barely spoke, was an exceptional whistler and did it unconsciously while he worked. She learned that Caleb woke before dawn every day, every single day without exception, and that the first thing he did was stand at the kitchen window with his coffee and look east. She'd started getting up early herself. She'd always been an early riser, and on mornings when she came down and found him there, he'd pour her a cup without being asked, and they'd both stand at the window for a few minutes, not talking, watching the dark ease into gray. She didn't know exactly when that became a part of her day she relied on. It just did. Thomas had a bad week in late June that no one could quite explain. He was sullen at meals, resistant to his chores, short-tempered with Ira over something that happened in the barn. He stopped asking for the reading at night. Caleb handled it the way he seemed to handle most things involving his son's interior life, with a kind of helpless patience, doing the practical things and hoping the difficult parts would pass. On Thursday of that week, Mabel found Thomas sitting on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looking south toward nothing in particular. She didn't ask him what was wrong. In her experience, asking children what was wrong produced either nothing or a surface answer that wasn't the real thing. She sat on the fence post next to his. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. After a while, Thomas said, "Do you miss Ohio?" "Some things," she said. "What things?" She thought about it honestly. "My sister Clara." She's irritating, but I miss her. She paused. Good bread from the bakery. My bed was more comfortable. Thomas was quiet. What made you think of Ohio? She asked. A longer pause. He was picking at the fence post with his thumbnail. Jimmy Aldrich at school said you only came here because no one in Ohio wanted you. The directness of it, the casual cruelty of children repeating things they'd heard adults say, hit somewhere specific in her chest. She sat with it for a moment. What do you think? She asked. Thomas frowned. I think Jimmy Aldrich is stupid. He's not stupid, she said. He's repeating something he heard. It's still wrong. Is it? She looked at the south horizon. I wasn't exactly overwhelmed with offers in Ohio, Thomas. That part's true. He was looking at her now, that intense dark gaze. Then why does it matter if it's true? It's still mean to say it. She considered him, 8 years old and already working out the difference between accuracy and kindness, which was more than a lot of adults managed. You're right, she said. It is. She looked back at the horizon. But I'm here now. And I like being here. She paused. More than I expected to, actually. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad you came. He said it looking at the fence post, still picking at it, in the tone of someone delivering information rather than sentiment, and it was entirely possible that he didn't fully understand how much weight it carried. She didn't make a fuss of it. She just sat with him on the fence post a little longer. I know, she said. Right. The first real test came in August. She'd been at Granger Ranch 4 months, which was long enough to know the rhythms, but not long enough to have been tested by anything serious. Then the blight hit the south pasture, some kind of dry rot in the grass, spreading faster than made sense. And Caleb came in from his evening check looking like a man who had been handed bad news and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. She could see it in his face before he said a word. He told her at supper after Thomas had gone upstairs, laid it out flat, the way he always did, the scope of it, the southern pasture largely lost for the season, which meant moving the herd north earlier than planned, which meant pressure on the north pasture's grass supply, which meant buying feed that they hadn't budgeted for. She got the supply ledger without being asked. They sat at the table for 2 hours going through numbers. It was solvable, barely, and not without cost, but solvable. She found margins she'd been accumulating since April, the savings on winter supplies from buying early, the extra from the delayed fall sales she'd planned, a reserve in the account she'd quietly built by renegotiating 3 of the recurring supply contracts in July after the bank visit. When she put the numbers in front of him, Caleb stared at them for a long time. You built that cushion on purpose, he said. I built it in case something went wrong, she said. Something always goes wrong. He looked up at her. How did you know? I didn't know specifically. She closed the ledger. I just know that's how things work. You plan for the worst that's likely and hope you're wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, late August in Wyoming, the first suggestion of what autumn would bring. Eleanor was better at the hopeful end of things, he said. It was the most he'd said about his first wife in all the months she'd been there, and it landed quietly between them. She planned for the best. I planned for nothing. We were... He paused. Mismatched in that particular way. I'm not a hopeful person by nature, Mabel said carefully. I'm a prepared person. I know. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before, something that was neither gratitude nor admiration exactly, but was in that general territory. I'm starting to understand that there's a difference. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, with the ledger between them, and the wind outside and the sound of the house settling, and she thought, this is not love. Not yet. But it is something that might become something. She didn't say that. It was too large to say out loud and too early to say it anyway. She said, we should reroute the herd by Tuesday if we're going to get ahead of the pasture transition. But Tuesday, he agreed. They went back to the numbers. The lamp burned low. Neither of them noticed until it was almost out. September came in hard. Not gradually, not with the slow cooling that Mabel had known in Ohio, where autumn was a negotiation between summer and winter, weeks of golden compromise before the cold made its final argument. Wyoming did not negotiate. One week the evenings were warm enough to sit on the porch after supper. The next week the sky went the color of old pewter, and the wind came down from the north with the kind of intent that made you understand, physically and not just intellectually, that this land could kill you if you gave it the opportunity. Caleb had warned her. He'd said in August, when she was still learning to read the ranch's rhythms, that October would test everything they'd built, and that the first serious storm usually gave notice in September. She'd nodded and filed it away, the way she filed most things he told her, not dismissing it, but not fully understanding it either, because some things can't be understood until they're in front of you. The notice came on the 14th of September in the form of 3 days of sky so low and gray it felt like the ceiling of a room, and then a wind that started in the night and was still going 4 days later. No snow yet, but the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 days, and the cattle were restless in the way Pete said meant they could smell what was coming. "Early," Pete said at breakfast, which was the most alarmed she had heard him sound about anything. "How early?" Mabel asked. "A month, maybe 6 weeks." He drank his coffee. "We're not ready for a hard push yet." She looked at Caleb, who was eating without looking up, which was his version of not wanting to say what he was thinking. "Caleb," she said. He set down his fork. "The North Pasture Shelter's not finished. We started repairs in July and we're about 2 weeks short of done." He paused. "If we get a hard storm before it's finished, we lose the North Herd." The North Herd was 40% of the ranch's cattle. Mabel did not need to run the math to understand what that meant. "Then we finish it," she said. "In 2 weeks, in this wind, with 3 hands and myself, and me." She stood up from the table. "Tell me what needs doing." What needed doing was not glamorous work, and she didn't pretend it was. She spent 4 days on the shelter repair alongside the men, carrying lumber, holding boards while Pete nailed, passing tools, doing the parts that didn't require skills she didn't have, but required an extra pair of hands that were willing to be there. Her back ached in ways she hadn't known backs could ache. She tore the skin on her right palm on a rough board edge and wrapped it in a strip of cloth and kept working because stopping would have meant losing the light, and they couldn't afford to lose the light. Caleb watched her the first morning with an expression she recognized as him, deciding whether to say something. He didn't say anything. After the first hour, he stopped watching and started working beside her, which she took as its own kind of statement. On the third day, Ira, who had still not strung more than 10 words together in her presence across 5 months, looked at her during the noon break and said, unprompted, "You don't have to be out here, ma'am." "I know," she said. He nodded once, in the way of someone who has registered something and decided it matters, and went back to his food. The shelter was finished in 11 days. 2 days later, the first real storm of the season came down from the north, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight, and Mabel stood at the kitchen window in the early morning dark and watched snow move sideways past the glass, and felt something that was partly exhaustion and partly something she didn't have a name for yet. All 40 cattle in the North Herd were in the shelter. Caleb came downstairs and stood beside her at the window, and she felt rather than saw his exhale, the slow release of breath of a man who had been holding tension for 2 weeks and could finally let some of it go. "We'd have lost 30 head, he said quietly. "Maybe more." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." She didn't deflect it. She'd spent too many years deflecting things she'd earned. "You're welcome," she said, and poured them both coffee, and they stood at the window and watched the storm move across the valley in the first pale light of morning. Harlan Crow came back in October, and this time he didn't bother with pleasantries. He rode in with Fuller, the scarred man she'd heard about but not yet seen, and 2 others she didn't recognize, and he did not wait to be invited to the porch. He came across the yard as if he had standing on it, which was the particular manner of a man who has decided that the social contracts other people observe don't apply to him. Caleb was in the barn. Mabel was in the yard splitting kindling because the kindling box needed filling, and standing around waiting for someone else to do it had never been her approach to anything. Crow stopped a few feet from her, and she straightened up and looked at him with the axe still in her hand, which she suspected he found mildly disconcerting and which she did not adjust. "Mrs. Granger," he said. That same practiced pleasantness, but it sat differently this time, less patient underneath. "I need to speak with your husband. He'll be out shortly." She set another piece of wood on the stump. Is this a social call? Business. He looked around the yard, and she recognized the way he was looking, the appraising look of a man calculating what things were worth. Fuller and the others had stopped near the fence, and Fuller was doing the same kind of slow inventory of the buildings. What kind of business? She asked. Crow refocused on her with the slight recalibration of a man who keeps expecting her to be less present than she is. Ranch business, he said. Between myself and your husband. I manage the ranch finances, she said. Whatever business brings you here, I'll need to be part of the conversation. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has found something faintly amusing. I see. I don't think you do, she said evenly. But you will. Caleb came out of the barn and crossed the yard, and she watched Crow's posture shift slightly toward him, the natural male pivot toward the man in the situation, the assumption that the real conversation could now begin. Caleb, Crow said, I'll come straight to it. I know you had losses this summer with the blight. I know you're heading into winter short. I'm prepared to offer you $4,200 for the valley parcel, the South 40, and the water access corridor. You keep the ranch buildings and the north pasture. You'd clear your debt and have enough left to make it through. Caleb's expression didn't change. The valley parcel's not for sale, Harlan. Caleb, the whole ranch is not for sale, so the valley parcel especially is not for sale. Crow's pleasantness thinned slightly. I'm offering you a way out of a difficult position. The blight, the early storms. We covered the losses, Mabel said. Both men looked at her, Crow with some surprise, Caleb with something that was quieter than surprise. I'm sorry, Crow said. The summer losses. We covered them. She set down the axe and picked up her small ledger, which she'd started carrying in her apron pocket because this particular conversation had been a matter of when rather than if, and she had prepared for it accordingly. We restructured the supply contracts in July, delayed our fall sale, and cleared 11% above last year's price, and we built a reserve during the blight because I'd planned for the likelihood of emergency expenses. The debt you're referring to, she opened the ledger to the relevant page, was retired last week. Crow was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before. Not quite respect, not yet, but the specific face a man makes when he realizes he has been operating on the wrong information. Last week, he repeated. Thursday. She closed the ledger. So the position you're offering to help us out of doesn't currently exist. A long pause. Fuller, behind Crow, had stopped doing his inventory of the buildings and was now watching her with considerably more attention. Well, Crow said, and the pleasantness had gone almost entirely now, replaced by something that was doing a reasonable impression of diplomacy while not being it. Circumstances change. I'm sure the winter will be long. It usually is, she agreed. We're prepared for that too. Crow looked at Caleb. Your wife is forthcoming, he said, which was the most negative thing that could be said in the most superficially polite way. She is, Caleb said. It's one of the things I value most about her. Crow nodded once, the nod of a man recalibrating without admitting he's doing so. He tipped his hat to Mabel, which was correct social form and meant nothing. Enjoy your winter then, he said, and turned back to his horse. She watched him ride out with his men, and she was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing exactly, but present, the physical evidence of something that mattered. The debt was retired Thursday, Caleb said beside her. Yes. You didn't tell me. I was going to tell you at supper. She picked up the axe and set another piece of wood on the stump. I wanted to have the receipt in hand first. He was quiet for a moment. She split the wood. He picked up the pieces and stacked them without being asked, which was not something he'd done before. And she noticed it, but didn't say anything. He'll come back, Caleb said. I know. She said another piece, but not with the same argument. What she hadn't told Caleb, and what she spent the following 2 weeks trying to work out on her own before she had to, was that Crow's retreat was not the same thing as Crow giving up. She understood this in the way she understood most things about powerful men who didn't like being told no, from watching her father, from watching the men in her mother's social circle. From a lifetime of quiet observation from the position of someone who was largely considered not worth managing because she wasn't considered a factor worth managing, People said things around her they wouldn't have said around someone they were paying attention to. She had learned early to use that. What she learned over the following weeks, through a combination of Pete's town intelligence and her own careful conversation with Mrs. Alderman, the judge's wife, who turned out to be an extraordinarily well-informed woman whom Mabel had begun having coffee with on her bi-weekly trips to town, was that Crow was not going to make another direct offer. He was going to do something more patient and more dangerous. He was going to work the water. The water access corridor that ran through the valley parcel was Granger Ranch's primary year-round water source. Crow owned land on both sides of it to the north. He didn't have legal access to it, but he had been quietly, over the past year, filing surveys and boundary queries with the Territorial Land Office that were, according to Mrs. Alderman, whose husband saw all the legal filings that came through Linden Creek, designed to create a paper ambiguity about where the water corridor legally began. If the ambiguity became a legal question, it would go to the Territorial Land Court, which took months, which cost money. Which was the point. She sat with this information for 2 days before she told Caleb. She told him on a Thursday evening after Thomas was in bed, because she had learned that difficult conversations went better when he wasn't managing two things at once. She laid it out the same way she laid out the finances, plainly, with the relevant details in order, without softening it. Caleb sat with it for a long time after she was done. She could see him working through it, testing its logic, looking for the angles she might have missed. This was something she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't dismiss things because they were complicated or because he hadn't seen them first. He thought about them. "How solid is Alderman's information?" he said finally. "She was very specific," Mabel said. "She described the filing numbers. If he establishes even a question about the boundary, then we're in litigation while our cattle are dying of thirst," she said. "Yes. That's the outcome he's building toward." Caleb stood up and went to the window, which was his physical habit when he was thinking through something he hadn't resolved yet. Outside, the November dark was complete. No moon that night, just the thick black of a Wyoming winter night. "Can we counterfile?" she asked. "I don't know enough about land law to know what that would look like." "There's an attorney in Rawlins," she said, "a woman named Doris Marsh, who handles territorial property cases." She paused because the next part required care. Mrs. Alderman mentioned her. "She's been in practice for 9 years. She's not the sort of attorney Crow would expect us to hire." Caleb turned from the window. "Because she's a woman. Because she's a woman, and because she's been winning cases against exactly this kind of filing manipulation for the better part of a decade, and Crow's people won't have her on their map of threats." She held his gaze. "The filing he's constructed is designed to create delay and expense. If we respond with the right kind of documentation, filed in the right sequence, before the ambiguity can take root, you've already thought through the response." "I've thought through what the response needs to accomplish," she said carefully. "I'm not a lawyer. Doris Marsh would need to work out the specifics." "Shit." He was looking at her in that particular way, not the measuring look from their early months. Not the way he'd looked at her when she was still someone he was evaluating. It was something else now, something more settled. "Write to her," he said. "Tell her what we need." Mabel wrote to Doris Marsh on a Friday morning and received a response by the following Thursday, which was fast enough that she suspected Marsh had read the letter more than once. The attorney's response was direct and practical, which Mabel appreciated immediately. She outlined 3 counterfilings that could be made within 10 days. Each of which addressed a different element of Crow's manufactured ambiguity. She asked for specific documents: the original land survey from Caleb's father's purchase, any records of water usage predating Crow's arrival in the territory, correspondence with the Territorial Land Office over the previous 5 years. Mabel had most of this already. She'd gone through the ranch's filing box in her first weeks, organized what she found, and flagged the documents she thought might matter without yet knowing why they'd matter. She pulled them now, and they were exactly what Marsh needed. She wrote back within the day. What happened next moved faster than she'd anticipated, which was not how land disputes usually moved. Usually they moved like rivers in drought, slowly and with great effort. But Marsh turned out to be a woman who operated at a speed that matched her sharpness, and the counterfilings went in with a completeness that Crow's legal people had not prepared for. She heard about the result from two directions simultaneously. Mrs. Alderman over coffee in late November, who said that word around the land office was that the Granger counterfiling had effectively neutralized all three of Crow's boundary claims. And Pete Dalloway, who'd been in the saloon the previous weekend and heard from one of Crow's own hands that Crow had been, in the hand's understated phrase, not pleased. When Mabel relayed this to Caleb over dinner, he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You built the counterfiling from the documents you organized in April." "Some of them, yes." "You organized those documents 5 months before we needed them." "I didn't know we'd need them specifically," she said. "I just organized everything because disorganized records are a liability." Thomas, who had been tracking this conversation with the intense focus of a child following something that he mostly understood, said, "So Crow tried to steal our water and Mabel stopped it." "That's one way to put it," Caleb said. "Is there another way to put it?" Caleb looked at Mabel across the table, and something in his face was completely unguarded for a moment, unguarded in a way she'd only seen from him in rare, undefended moments. "No," he said. "That's pretty much what happened." Thomas appeared satisfied with this assessment and returned to his beans. The winter deepened through December, and with it came the particular intimacy of people shut in together by cold and distance, the kind of closeness that can't be manufactured but either grows or doesn't, depending on what people are made of. She and Caleb had settled into a cadence she would have found difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. They worked alongside each other in the practical ways that ranch life demanded, but they'd developed a layer of conversation underneath that wasn't about the ranch. Opinions about things, observations, the small, sharp exchanges of two people who had started to understand each other's sense of humor and weren't fully pretending they didn't. He made her laugh once in a while, which she hadn't expected. Not with jokes. He wasn't built for jokes. But with the occasional perfectly timed understatement delivered in a deadpan that caught her off guard. She'd learned to watch for it. But what was growing between them sat alongside something she couldn't ignore, which was the thing he hadn't told her yet. She could feel it. There was a room in him she hadn't been let into, something he was managing that had nothing to do with cattle or water rights or Harlan Crow. It showed up in small ways, the way he sometimes went very still when Thomas said something about his mother, the way he'd start a sentence about the ranch's early years and then redirect, the look she'd catch on his face sometimes in the early morning at the window, something she'd initially interpreted as tiredness but now understood was something older and harder than that. She did not push. She had learned in her own life that being pushed into something you weren't ready to say only made you less likely to say it, and she trusted that if he had something to tell her, he'd tell her when it was ready to be told. It happened on a Saturday night in December, after the worst storm of the year had kept everyone inside for 3 days, and the relief of it ending had left a sort of loose, quiet feeling in the house. Thomas was asleep. The wind had died. Mabel was at the kitchen table with her sewing kit and one of Caleb's work shirts that needed a collar repair, and Caleb was supposed to be reading but wasn't. He'd had the same page open for 20 minutes. "Eleanor didn't die of illness," he said. She set down the shirt. He was looking at the table, not at her. His hands were flat on it, the way they went when he was making himself be still. "She died in the spring, 4 years ago. There was flooding on the eastern creek. It happens some years. Snowmelt comes too fast. She went out to check the stock crossing, and the bank gave way." He paused. Thomas was inside. "I was on the north pasture." The house was very quiet. "I got to her," he said. "I wasn't—" He stopped. "It took me too long to understand what the sound was. The water. By the time I understood—" He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't fill the silence for him, because this was not a silence that needed filling. This was the kind of silence that had waited 4 years to be allowed to exist. After a while, she said, "You heard it from the north pasture." "Yes." "And you went?" "As fast as I could." "Then you did everything you could do," she said. Plainly, not to comfort him, just because it was true. "That's not how it feels." "I know," she said. "It probably won't. That's not the same as it not being true." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the post-storm silence was complete, that profound, specific quiet that follows 3 days of wind, as if the world itself is catching its breath. I haven't told Thomas the full account, he said. He knows she drowned. He doesn't know I was on the property. Do you think he blames you? I don't know. His voice had the quality of something that had been held underwater for a long time. I'm afraid to find out. She looked at him across the table. This man she had married as a practical arrangement and lived beside for 8 months and was, she understood now with a clarity that had been arriving gradually and was now fully present, in love with, in the difficult, specific way of someone who has learned a person rather than imagined them. He doesn't, she said. I've been watching him for 8 months. He misses her. He's sad about her. He doesn't blame you. Caleb looked at her for the first time since he'd started talking. How can you know that? Because I asked him, she said. In September. On the fence post. I didn't ask directly. He's 8, you don't ask directly, but I asked around it and I heard the answer. He was very still. He thinks about her, she said. He talks about her sometimes when we're reading. Did you know she used to read to him? He mentioned it once. She kept her voice even. He doesn't carry anger about how she died. He carries the missing. Caleb's jaw moved. He looked down at his hands. You should tell him, she said. Not all at once, not tonight. But someday, when he's older and asking. He deserves the full account. I know. His voice was rough at the edges. I've known that. She picked up the shirt again. Not to dismiss the moment, she picked it up to give him somewhere to breathe that wasn't being directly looked at, because that was what the moment needed. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, not talking much, the lamp burning between them, the storm-silenced ranch settling outside. She finished the collar repair. He eventually turned the page of his book. Before he went upstairs, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. Mabel, he said. She looked up. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood there in the doorway, holding whatever he was going to say, and then he said, Thank you for listening. You don't have to thank me for that, she said. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man who has said something true and knows it. Then he went upstairs, and she heard his footsteps cross the ceiling above her, and then it was quiet, and she sat alone in the kitchen with the finished shirt in her hands, and the lamp burning low, and the knowledge that something had shifted in the architecture of this house tonight. Some weight that had been distributed wrong had been moved, just slightly, to where it could be better carried. It wasn't fixed. It was going to take a long time to be anything close to fixed. But it had moved. That was something. January in Wyoming was not a month. It was a condition. Mabel understood this by the second week of it. Understood it in her body, in the particular ache of rising before dawn into cold that had settled into the house overnight despite the banked fire. In the way the light came late and left early, and was never quite generous even at its peak. Ohio winters had been cold. This was something categorically different. This was cold as a permanent fact. Cold as the baseline from which all other temperatures were measured. Cold that made you understand why the animals grew thick coats, and why the men who worked outside came in at midday looking hollowed out. She did not complain about it, partly because complaining about Wyoming weather to people who had survived it for decades seemed impolite, and partly because she had made a private decision sometime in the fall that she was going to be someone who adapted rather than someone who endured. There was a difference. Enduring was passive. Adapting was a choice you made every morning when you put your feet on the cold floor. What January also brought, in its long housebound hours, was the particular closeness of people with nowhere to go. The December night when Caleb had told her about Eleanor, about the flood, about the North Pasture, about the 4 years of guilt he'd been carrying with the particular silence of a man who doesn't believe he has the right to put it down, had changed something between them that neither of them named directly. What it had changed was a kind of distance. Not unfriendliness, they'd never been unfriendly, but the specific distance that exists between two people who are still, on some level, regarding each other as arrangements rather than choices. After December, they were choices. She understood that about herself, and she suspected from small evidences she'd been accumulating the way she accumulated everything, quietly, carefully, without announcing it, that he understood it about himself too. He started doing small things differently, nothing dramatic. He was not a dramatic man, and she would not have trusted a dramatic man. But he started asking her opinion on things before he decided rather than after, consulting her the way you consulted someone whose judgment you'd come to rely on, not the way you informed someone of decisions you'd already made. He started staying at the kitchen table longer in the evenings instead of taking himself off to the study. One morning in January, he came downstairs early and found her at the window with her coffee in the dark, and he stood beside her the way he always did. And after a few minutes, he put his hand over hers on the windowsill, just for a moment, just briefly, and then went to pour his own coffee as if nothing had happened. She kept her face very still, and her heart did something she chose not to examine too closely. Thomas was having a better winter than his father, which was usually the way with children. They found resources in difficult conditions that adults had trained themselves not to look for. The reading after supper had become a fixed ritual, one that Thomas would have defended against interruption with the ferocity of a much larger person, and they had moved through 2 novels since October and were well into a third. But the shift Mabel noticed in Thomas was subtler than new habits. It was something in the way he moved through the house, less carefully, less like a child monitoring the atmosphere for things he needed to manage. She'd watched him do that in the early months. The small adjustments he made to his behavior based on what he read in his father's face, the way he went quiet when Caleb went quiet, the way he tried to take up exactly the right amount of space and no more. He was doing that less. She didn't take credit for this directly because it wasn't simple enough for direct credit. It was the accumulation of a year of dinners and fence posts and oatmeal and reading, of Thomas slowly understanding through repetition that the people around him were not going to suddenly rearrange and leave him to manage on his own. What she did notice, and what moved her in a way she kept private, was the specific way Thomas had started including her in the permanent inventory of his world. Not she's here now, but she's here. The difference was the present tense becoming simply the tense. He called her Mabel, which they'd agreed on in the beginning. He did not call her mother, and she had never expected him to. But one afternoon in January, she overheard him telling Ira, with the authority of a child conveying important information, that Mabel said the weather was going to hold for 2 more days and that she was usually right about these things. And the casual possessive in it, Mabel says, caught her entirely off guard, and she had to go do something in the larder for a few minutes until her face sorted itself out. She discovered she was pregnant on a Wednesday in February. She was almost certain before she confirmed it. She had been paying attention to her body with the careful attention of a woman who knows that inattention to such things can have consequences. And the confirmation arrived in the form of a morning sickness that hit her 3 days in a row with such precision that there was not much room left for uncertainty. She sat on the edge of the bed in the early morning dark, after Caleb had gone downstairs, and she held this information inside herself for a while. She was not 20 years old. She was 30, and she knew, because she had read enough to know, that being 30 and pregnant in a frontier territory with the nearest physician 60 miles away in Rawlins was not the same thing as being 20 and pregnant in Ohio, with a doctor 3 streets over and a mother down the hall. She knew what could go wrong. She was not a person who avoided knowing what could go wrong. She was also, and this arrived alongside the fear, not instead of it, but genuinely alongside it, something that was building toward happy. She was careful with the word even inside her own head, because she'd been disappointed enough times by things she'd wanted that she was protective of wanting. But it was there. A child. Something entirely new. Built from this life she'd built from nothing, from this man she hadn't planned on, and this place she hadn't chosen, and this self she was still in the process of becoming. She went downstairs and told Caleb at breakfast, after Thomas had left for school, because Thomas was 9 and resilient, but some conversations needed to be had between adults first. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. "I'm pregnant. I think about 3 months." Caleb had his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He set it down. He looked at her with an expression she'd never quite seen from him before, something layered and complicated and moving too fast for her to read all of it. And then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and sat down in the chair beside her, which was not a thing he'd ever done before. And he put his hands on the table near hers, not quite touching. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "How are you feeling?" "Nauseous in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise all right." "Rawlins," he said immediately, which meant his mind had gone where hers had already been. "Dr. Purcell, he's the physician there. We need to get you to him." "I know. I'll take you next week. There's no reason to wait." His hands moved to cover hers on the table, properly this time, not the brief window moment of January, but deliberately. "Whatever you need, tell me what you need." She looked at him. At the focused urgency in his face, the way he was already working through logistics, the way his hands were tight around hers, she understood what she was seeing, and it moved her. He was afraid. Not in an uncontrolled way, not in a way that made him helpless, but afraid the way you're afraid when something becomes so important that the possibility of losing it becomes real in your body. She understood this because she felt it too. "I need to not be managed," she said carefully. "I need you to be honest with me about what the risks are and not try to protect me from information." He met her eyes. "All right. And I need Thomas to know soon. He's perceptive. He'll notice before we tell him if we wait too long, and it'll upset him more to feel managed than to just know." "All right." A pause. "What else?" She turned her hands over under his so she could hold them back. "That's the list for now," she said. "I'll add to it as I think of things." Something shifted in his face, that thing that happened when he was close to a smile but hadn't committed to it. "You'll definitely add to it," he said. "I will," she agreed. They told Thomas on Saturday. Caleb told him, which was the right choice. She'd thought about this carefully and decided that it needed to come from Caleb first, because Thomas's primary relationship with this information was through his father, and the way Caleb handled it would shape how Thomas understood it was safe to feel. She listened from the kitchen while she worked, hearing the low murmur of Caleb's voice in the front room, not the words. A silence. Then Thomas's voice, higher and sharper than usual. Then, after a pause, footsteps, and Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment, and she could see him working through something, a child processing faster than he could probably explain. "Pa says you're going to have a baby," he said. "Yes." "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know for a while yet." He thought about this. "Jimmy Aldrich has a baby sister, and he says she's annoying." "Jimmy Aldrich says a lot of things," she said. Something happened on Thomas's face, the beginning of a grin that he was working to keep dignified. "Yeah." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. "Will it sleep in your room?" "For a while, probably. Jimmy's sister cried all night for a year." "That's possible," she admitted. He picked up an apple from the bowl on the table and turned it over in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was approaching the real question from the side. "Will things change?" he asked. "Like, the way things are now?" She set down what she was doing and looked at him directly, because he was 9 and he deserved a direct answer. "Some things will change," she said. "There'll be a baby, and babies take up a lot of room and time. Some of our routines will shift." She paused. "The reading won't change, dinner won't change. You and me and your father, the way we are, that's not changing." Thomas turned the apple over once more. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. He nodded, the nod of a person who has received the information they needed and has now filed it. He set the apple down. "Can it be a girl?" he said. "I think I'd be better with a girl. A boy would probably want to use my things." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came without warning. "I'll see what I can do," she said. Thomas grinned finally, properly, and went back to his father, and Mabel turned back to the work table and stood for a moment with her hands on the counter, feeling something she had not felt in her life before coming here, something she didn't want to poke at too directly, in case examining it made it smaller. She let it be. The trip to Rollins was 2 days, which meant an overnight at the hotel she'd stayed in when she first arrived almost a year ago. Dr. Purcell was a compact, serious man in his 60s who examined her with professional thoroughness and told her she was healthy, the pregnancy was progressing normally, and that she should plan to be back in Rollins by mid-July, which was his estimate of when the delivery would occur, so that she could be near his practice. "What if the birth comes early?" Caleb asked, from his chair against the wall, where he'd been sitting with his hat in his hand since they came in. 60 miles is too far for an emergency, the doctor said. "You'll need to relocate to Rollins for the final 6 weeks at minimum. Mrs. Granger should not deliver in Linden Creek without a physician present." Caleb's jaw tightened. Mabel watched him calculate this. 6 weeks away from the ranch in peak summer, with the hands to manage, with a cattle operation that required oversight. "I'll work it out," he said. He wasn't talking to the doctor. He was talking to her. "I know you will," she said. On the ride back to Linden Creek, After the first 10 miles of silence that was him thinking, he said, "Pete can run the operation. He's done it before. When I was down with the fence post injury, he ran it for 3 weeks." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing. We'd need to set up the book so he has access to the supply accounts. I'll do that in May. Give him time to get comfortable with the system before I'm gone." Caleb glanced at her sideways. "You'd already started thinking about this." "I started thinking about it on the way to Rollins," she said. "I had 60 miles. He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the winter landscape, the road visible only as a slightly smoother line through the snow, the sky low and gray and permanent. "I was not—" He stopped, tried again. "With Eleanor, I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. Toward the end, there were things I prioritized over—" He didn't finish. She looked at him. He was keeping his eyes on the road, the way he did when he was saying something he hadn't quite made peace with. "I'm not going to do that again," he said. "Whatever the ranch needs, it can wait." "You don't wait." She sat with this for a moment. She understood the weight of it, what it cost him to say it, given what waiting had cost him before. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, significant enough that she needed to be careful about how she received it. "I'm not Eleanor," she said, gently but clearly. "I don't need you to stand guard over me every minute. I need you to take what happened with her and let it make you more present, not more frightened." She looked at the road ahead. "Those are different things." He was quiet. "Can you tell the difference?" she asked. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Quote, February became March, and March became the particular tentative thing that passed for spring in Wyoming. Not a thaw exactly, more a loosening, the land beginning to consider the possibility of something other than winter. The pregnancy made her body strange to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not bad exactly. She was not seriously ill. The morning nausea leveled off by 10 weeks. She could work. But her body was doing things on its own schedule with a kind of autonomy she found disconcerting. Someone who was accustomed to understanding what her body was doing and why. She was tired in the afternoons in a way that felt chemical rather than physical. Her sense of smell had become absurdly acute. She could smell the difference between Pete's coat and Cobb's coat from across the yard, which she'd not asked to be able to do. She told Caleb about the smell thing one evening, and he looked at her with an expression that was doing its best to be sympathetic, and not quite managing to suppress the fact that he also found it slightly funny. "I could smell the coffee from the bunkhouse last Tuesday," she said, "from inside the house." "That's remarkable? Terrible? I'm not sure which. Both, maybe." He was definitely holding back a smile now. "It's not funny. I know." He was not succeeding. "Caleb." "I know." He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry." She looked at him with great dignity. "You are not sorry at all." "I'm sympathetic," he said. "That's adjacent." She threw the dishcloth at him, which she would not have done in January, and he caught it, which was faster than she'd expected, and the surprise of that made her laugh despite herself. And he laughed too, a real laugh, one of those that came infrequently but completely. And for a moment the kitchen was full of it, the easy, unforced warmth of two people who had stopped being careful with each other. Thomas appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt and looked at them both with the expression of a child confronting adult behavior he doesn't fully understand. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," they said simultaneously. Thomas looked between them, deeply unconvinced, then turned around and went back upstairs. Twet. Spring also brought a letter from Clara. Mabel had been writing to her sister since the beginning, short letters in the early months, longer ones as the winter progressed, and there was more to say. Clara had written back reliably, and their correspondence had settled into something honest in a way their relationship had never quite been when they lived in the same house. In March, Clara's letter was different. She'd told their mother about the pregnancy. Mabel hadn't asked her to, but she wasn't surprised. And their mother had apparently been, in Clara's careful phrasing, very quiet about it for several days, and then said she would like to write. A letter from their mother had not yet arrived, but Clara was warning her it was coming. There was more. Clara had been asking questions in her letters about Wyoming, what it was like, whether it was lonely, whether the life was as hard as people said. Mabel had answered honestly. In this letter, Clara wrote, "I've been thinking about coming to visit. In the summer, perhaps, if you'd have me." I know that's presumptuous given everything, but I'd like to see you, Mabel. I'd like to see who you've become out there. Mabel read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the March afternoon light. She thought she'd processed what her sisters had done. The advertisement, the cruel joke, the assumption that she was so far beneath consideration that using her name as a punchline was harmless. She thought she'd set it down somewhere behind her and left it there. Reading Clara's letter, she found that she hadn't entirely. There was still something sore in the place where it had happened, still a residue of it, and the particular pain of being asked back in by the people who had pushed you out was its own complicated thing. She showed the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it. He handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "She's asking to come here," he said, "not asking you to go back." She looked at him. "I noticed that too." "There's a difference," he said, which was almost exactly what she'd been thinking. "There is." She folded the letter. "I'd have to think about what I want it to mean." "Take your time," he said. "She's not coming until summer. You've got months." She tucked the letter into her apron pocket and sat with it through the evening, and what she kept returning to was this. Clara had said who you've become. Not if you're all right or how things are going, but who you've become, which meant Clara understood, on some level, that she had become someone and wanted to see it. That was not nothing. Mutt. The letter from their mother arrived 10 days later, and it was 3 pages long, which was 2 pages longer than their mother had ever written to Mabel in her life. She read it alone, in the morning before anyone else was up. It was not an apology. Her mother was not constructed for direct apology, and Mabel had known better than to expect one. But it was something else, something her mother probably hadn't intended as an apology, but that functioned as one in the negative space of what it said and what it carefully didn't say. Her mother wrote about the pregnancy with a cautious warmth, asking about the physician, asking about the house, asking what they needed. That was so different from her usual tone that Mabel read the first page twice to make sure she hadn't imagined it. Toward the end, her mother wrote, "I have thought about the circumstances under which you came to make this decision, and I have thought about what your sisters told me they did, and I find I don't have adequate words for what I think of it. Or perhaps I have the words and am not ready to say them yet. What I can say is that you have always been more capable than we gave you credit for, and I have known this and chosen not to say so frequently enough. And I am saying it now because it seems important, and I have been putting off saying things that are important for long enough." Mabel put the letter down on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and read the last paragraph again. She did not cry. She was not, in general, a woman who cried easily, and even if she had been, the emotion this produced was too mixed and too complicated to come out as simple tears. It was the particular complicated feeling of being seen by someone who has the power to wound you, after years of expecting not to be seen. She wrote back that afternoon. Not a long letter. Not forgiving everything in a rush, not pretending the past year of distance had been nothing. But honest, the way she'd been learning to be honest. In the careful way of someone who knows that honesty isn't the same as saying everything all at once. She wrote, "I am well. The ranch is well. The baby comes in July and we are prepared. You should know that I am happy here and that this is not the kind of thing I say without meaning it. If you want to come and see it for yourself, you would be welcome, but only if you come without conditions, and only if you come understanding that this is my life now and I have built it myself, and I am not going to minimize it for anyone's comfort. On those terms, the door is open." She sealed the letter and set it with the mail for town. She felt, when she let go of it, lighter than she'd expected. April came with mud and the first green things, and the particular energy of a ranch waking back up after months of endurance. She was visibly pregnant now, unmistakably so, and she moved through the ranch work with the adjustments this required, doing what she could, handing off what she couldn't, refusing to be treated as fragile in the ways she found patronizing while accepting the help she actually needed. These distinctions were sometimes lost on the ranch hands, who operated on a general policy of women who were pregnant should not do things, a policy she was chipping away at through repeated demonstration. Pete had adjusted fastest. He'd seen women work through pregnancies on the frontier before, and he had a practical respect for capacity that overrode his caution. Cobb deferred to Pete's lead. Ira, who was now 18 and slightly less monosyllabic than he'd been a year ago, mostly watched her with the look of someone filing information he'd need later. What she hadn't entirely accounted for was Caleb. He was not overbearing. She'd warned him against that, and he was trying. She could see the trying. But he was watchful in a way that was occasionally more than watchful. He was there when she came out of the house in the morning, usually with some reason to be in the yard. He was in the vicinity when she was doing things that involved ladders or heights or anything that required balance. He was managing his fear, she understood, but the managing of it was visible. She waited until they were alone, one evening after a dinner where he'd redirected her twice from things she was doing without being asked, and she said, "I need you to tell me when you're afraid instead of moving things." He looked at her. "When you're scared," she said, "say so. Don't rearrange the kitchen to keep me away from the high shelf. Say, I'm worried about you on the step stool." A pause. "I moved the kitchen because I know why you moved things." She kept her voice even. "I'm asking you not to do it without telling me. Because when you do things without telling me, I feel managed. And I told you in the beginning that I don't want to be managed." He sat with this. "All right," he said finally. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at him. "You're allowed to be afraid. I'm afraid too. We're just going to be afraid together, out in the open, instead of alone where it turns into something else." He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was something she'd been watching build for months, a kind of settled, complete recognition. Not the way he'd looked at her in their early months, the measuring look of a man evaluating an arrangement, the way you look at someone who has become load-bearing in your life, someone whose absence would change the structure of everything. "I'm afraid," he said, simply. Just that. "I know," she said. "Me too." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. They sat like that for a while, the April evening light going long and gold through the kitchen window, the sounds of the ranch settling into its evening quiet. It was not a perfect moment. Her back ached. The milk cow had been difficult that morning. There was mud on the kitchen floor she hadn't gotten to yet. Outside, something needed fixing that would have to wait until morning. But his hand was under hers, and they were both, for the first time in a long time, exactly where they were supposed to be. Clara arrived on the first Tuesday of June, which was 3 weeks earlier than she'd originally planned, and 1 week after Mabel had written to tell her that the baby was coming sooner than expected, and that the trip to Rollins was being moved up. She came off the Linden Creek stage with a trunk that was too large for a visit, and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite managing it. Mabel was waiting at the depot with the wagon. Caleb had offered to come, but she'd said no. Some arrivals needed to be just between the people arriving and the person waiting. And when Clara saw her, she stopped on the step of the stage, and her face did something complicated and true. Mabel was 7 months pregnant and visibly so, standing in the Wyoming June sunshine in a practical dress she'd let out twice. And she suspected she did not look like anyone's idea of a frontier success story in any conventional sense. She was not thin, she was not graceful. Her hair was pinned up with more efficiency than elegance, and she had calluses on her hands that she hadn't had in Ohio, and there was a fading bruise on her left forearm from where she'd caught herself on the fence post last week. Clara came down the stage steps and crossed the depot platform and hugged her and held on. "You look," Clara started. "Don't say well," Mabel said. "I look like a woman who's been doing physical labor for 14 months. I was going to say like yourself." Clara pulled back and looked at her properly. The particular look of someone who has been worrying and is now recalibrating what they were worrying about. "More like yourself than I've ever seen." Mabel looked at her sister, her younger sister, who had always been the beautiful one, who had always moved through rooms in a way that gathered attention without effort, who had sat across a tea table from her for 29 years and thought that sending her name to a Wyoming rancher was a joke that wouldn't hurt anyone. "Get your trunk," Mabel said. "It's 40 minutes to the ranch." Bum. The 40 minutes in the wagon were not uncomfortable. That was the thing Mabel hadn't been sure of. Whether the distance between them had calcified into something that couldn't be crossed by proximity, and it turned out it hadn't. Clara asked real questions and accepted real answers, and when she was quiet, it was the quiet of someone listening rather than the quiet of someone waiting for their turn. She asked about the pregnancy, and Mabel told her about Dr. Purcell and the plan for Rollins. She asked about Thomas, and Mabel told her about the fence post and the beans with molasses and the reading after supper. She asked about Caleb carefully, in the way of someone who understands they're asking about something they don't have full standing to ask about. "He's a good man," Mabel said. "Not an easy one, but good." "Are you happy?" Clara asked. Not the polite version of the question, the real one. Mabel looked at the road ahead, at the valley opening up before them, the June grass coming in green and thick after the long winter, the sky so blue and so large it still occasionally surprised her, even after more than a year of it. "Yes," she said, and then, because Clara deserved the full honesty, "It took me a while to trust that, being happy in a place I didn't expect to be happy. It felt like I was waiting for something to come and take it back." "Did it come and take it back?" "Things tried." She thought of Harlan Crow, of the blight, of the December night and Eleanor's name and the weight Caleb had been carrying. Nothing succeeded. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about what we did," she said. "Dora and I know I apologized before you left. I'm not sure it was—" She paused. "I'm not sure an apology before someone leaves is the same as one after you can see what it might have cost." "It could have cost a great deal," Mabel said evenly, "if he'd been a different kind of man." "I know. But he wasn't." She looked at her sister. "So what I'll say is this. I don't want to spend the time you're here working through the accounting of who did what. I'd rather just go forward." Clara nodded. Her eyes were wet, which she was managing with some effort. "All right." "But Clara," Mabel's voice was measured and clear, "don't do things like that to anyone. Thinking someone is a joke is not the same as that person being a joke, and the difference matters in ways you can't always predict." Clara looked at her. "I know," she said. "I do know that now." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was easier than it had started, the wagon moving through the June afternoon, and when the ranch came into view, Clara leaned forward slightly on the seat and looked at it. The house, the barn, the fence lines running out across the valley, and she said quietly, "Oh." "What?" Mabel asked. "It's real," Clara said. "I knew it was real, but seeing it—" She shook her head slightly. "You built this." "I didn't build it," Mabel said. "It was already here. I just became part of it." "That's the same thing," Clara said. "That's exactly the same thing." Thomas evaluated Clara with the dispassionate thoroughness of a 9-year-old conducting an assessment he considers important. He shook her hand at introduction. Caleb had clearly coached him on this, and then looked at her with those dark, considering eyes and said, "You're Mabel's sister?" "I am," Clara said. "You look different from her." "Thomas," Caleb said. "It's true," Thomas said with the unassailable logic of a child who has not yet learned to find truth inconvenient. "We do look different," Clara agreed, with a grace Mabel appreciated. "We always have." Thomas considered this. "Mabel's better at fixing things," he said. "Are you good at fixing things?" Clara looked at Mabel with an expression that was suppressing a laugh. "Not as good as she is," she said. "I'm better at arranging flowers." Thomas appeared to file this under limited utility, but acceptable. "We don't have flowers," he said. "But there's some on the South Hill. Mabel could show you." "I'd like that," Clara said. And just like that, Thomas was satisfied and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and Caleb looked at Mabel over Clara's head with an expression that said he was revising his estimate of Clara upward. Harlan Crow made his final appearance on a Thursday morning in the second week of June, and it was the last appearance he would make, though none of them knew that going in. He came alone this time, which was different. No Fuller, no silent associate. Just Crow on a good horse, riding into the yard like a man who has decided to try something different because everything else hasn't worked. Mabel was on the porch with her coffee when he arrived, and Clara was inside, and Caleb was in the barn. She did not call for Caleb. She set down her coffee and stood up and walked to the porch railing and waited. Crow dismounted. He looked tired, she thought, not dramatically, not the visible exhaustion of a man in crisis, but the particular tiredness of someone who has been working at something for a long time and is beginning to calculate what it has cost. "Mrs. Granger," he said. "Mr. Crow." He looked at her for a moment, at her in a way he hadn't before. Not the dismissing look of their first meeting, not the reassessing look after she'd handled him in October. Something else. The look of a man trying to understand something that has stayed just outside his understanding. "I'd like to speak plainly," he said. "You've been speaking plainly since October," she said. "I've appreciated it." Something moved in his face. Not amusement, but something adjacent to respect, the grudging kind that comes from repeated evidence. "The land office claims," he said, "your attorney out of Rawlins. That was well done." "She's skilled," Mabel said. "You hired people who assumed the response would be slow. It wasn't." "No." He turned his hat in his hands, which was the first uncertain physical gesture she'd ever seen from him. "I want to propose something different." "All right." "Not the valley parcel. Not the water corridor." He looked at the ranch, the sweep of it, the way the valley opened up around the buildings. "A fair purchase of the eastern 40, which borders my north range and which I need for access, not for water. Market rate, not the pressure price I've been offering." He met her eyes. "I've been trying to buy this ranch for 6 years by making it too difficult to hold. That's not working, and I'm tired of it, and frankly—" He paused. "The community's opinion of me on this matter has been something I've had to hear about." She looked at him steadily. "The Eastern 40 isn't used for grazing. It's transition land." "I know. I'd have to look at the survey, and I'd have to talk to my husband, and we'd need Doris Marsh to review the terms before anything was signed." Crow nodded. "That's reasonable." "And the water filings," she said. "All of them. Formally withdrawn with documentation I can verify." A pause. Then, "I can do that." She looked at him. This man who had spent 6 years treating Granger Ranch like a problem to be solved rather than a place where people lived. And she understood something about him that she hadn't fully articulated before. He wasn't evil, exactly. He was the kind of man who had been successful long enough that the line between what he wanted and what he was entitled to had blurred, and the blurring had made him worse than he might have been. It happened to people. It didn't excuse it, but it explained it. "I'll speak with my husband," she said. "You'll hear from us by end of the week." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time with that expression she still couldn't entirely read, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "You weren't what I thought you were going to be," he said. "When Caleb took a wife, I thought—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He rode out, and this time she watched him go with something different than the guarded watchfulness she'd brought to every previous departure. He was still Harlan Crow, still the man who had sent Fuller to watch their fence lines and filed fraudulent boundary claims and tried to starve them into selling. She wasn't going to rewrite that history. But the war, such as it was over. And it had ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, unglamorous work of being too prepared to be beaten. Caleb came out of the barn. "I saw him ride in," he said. "You didn't call for me." "I didn't need to," she said. He came to stand beside her at the porch rail, looking in the direction Crow had gone. What did he want? She told him. The Eastern 40, the market price, the water filings. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, completely and in order, without editorializing until she was done. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He backed down," he said. "He ran out of approaches," she said. "Which is different, but the outcome's the same. Do you think we should take the deal?" She thought about it honestly. The Eastern 40 is not valuable to us, and it's needed access for him. Market rate is fair, and the water filings being formally withdrawn is worth more than the money. She paused. "But I want Doris Marsh to look at it before we sign anything, and I want 2 weeks to sit with it." 2 weeks, he agreed. He looked at her. "You handled him." "We handled him," she said. "You held the line for 6 years before I got here. I just added some paperwork." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "Is that what you call it?" "That's what I call it," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, carefully, because she was 7 months pregnant, and they were both still working out how to navigate space together. And she leaned into it slightly, and they stood on the porch of Granger Ranch in the June morning and looked out at the valley. And it was not a perfect moment, because their moments were never perfect. They were lived in and complicated and sometimes slightly off balance. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that she had come to understand was considerably better than perfect. She went to Rollins in the second week of July. Caleb drove her. Clara came along because she had extended her stay twice and showed no particular signs of leaving, a fact that Thomas had begun to treat as simply the way things were, which told Mabel something about how thoroughly her sister had won him over. Pete took the ranch, as planned. The supply accounts were organized. The hands had their instructions. The drive to Rollins took the better part of 2 days, and the second evening stopped at the same small hotel where Mabel had spent her first night in Wyoming 15 months before. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window she'd looked at then, and she tried to remember the woman who had sat in this room that first night, frightened and determined and not quite believing what she'd done. She couldn't get all the way back to her. Too much had happened in between. The woman she'd been then was still in her somewhere. She recognized the stubbornness, the practical turn of mind, the fundamental refusal to let other people's assessments become her own, but she'd been joined by other versions of herself, versions that knew what Wyoming looked like in January and what it felt like to stand in a cold barn with sore hands and understand that you were part of something that would persist past your effort. She heard Caleb in the next room, the creak of the floor as he moved, the sound of the chair, and she thought, "A year ago I read his letter in the kitchen in Ohio, and I did not know who he was. And now she knew him in the specific way you know someone you've weathered things with, someone whose silences you can read, and whose fears you can name, and who makes you laugh without trying." There was something about that she wanted to hold on to, because she understood it was not a guaranteed thing. It was a built thing. It had required constant building every day, through the parts that were hard and the parts that were tedious, and the parts where they misunderstood each other and had to work back to the truth. She thought, the women who laughed at the advertisement, her sisters, her mother, every person in Hatchet Falls who had filed her under difficult to place and moved on. She did not wish them ill, which surprised her when she checked. She had expected to find more anger in that particular corner and found instead something quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet the clean resolution that required more time and more letters and more sitting with it than she'd had. But the understanding that their opinion of her had never been the final word on what she was worth, and that she had always, on some level, known that, even when she'd had no evidence to point to. The evidence now was considerable. Eleanor Mabel Granger arrived on the 23rd of July, early in the morning, with Dr. Purcell present, and Clara in the hall outside, and Caleb, who had promised to stay out of the way, and had lasted approximately 40 minutes before appearing at the door, looking like a man who has discovered the limits of his own composure, holding her hand by the end. She weighed 7 pounds and some ounces, and she had dark hair that was emphatically Caleb's, and a mouth that Mabel could not look at without thinking it was entirely new, entirely its own, not inherited from anyone so much as arrived as itself. They had discussed names. Mabel had suggested Eleanor for Caleb's first wife, without being asked, in the way of someone who understands that honoring the dead is not the same as being replaced by them. Caleb had been very quiet when she suggested it. He'd asked if she was sure. She'd said yes. He hadn't said much more than that, but she'd seen what it meant to him, and that was enough. Eleanor, the baby. Eleanor, little Ellie, as Thomas immediately called her with the authority of a child staking linguistic claim on something, arrived with the uncomplicated urgency of newborns, wanting to be fed and held and acknowledged, not interested in the complexity of the story that had preceded her arrival. Mabel lay in the Rollins hotel room, that doctor. Purcell had converted to a reasonably functional birthing space and held her daughter and felt the specific, undiluted weight of another person who had not existed and now did. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. He was not composed. He had stopped trying to be composed, which was progress of a specific and important kind. "She looks like you," Mabel said. "She looks like nobody yet," he said. But he was looking at the baby with the helpless tenderness of a man who has lost the argument against his own heart. "She'll grow into someone," Mabel said. "They always do." Clara came in and held Ellie with the careful reverence of a woman who was discovering something she hadn't known she was capable of. And later, when she handed the baby back, she looked at Mabel with wet eyes and said, "She's remarkable." "She's a week old," Mabel said. "She hasn't done anything remarkable yet." "She exists," Clara said. "That's remarkable enough." Mabel looked at her sister. this woman she had left behind, and was slowly, carefully, imperfectly finding her way back toward, and she thought, maybe that's the real lesson. Not that everything works out, not that the people who hurt you become different people, not that justice arrives clean and complete. The real lesson is that existing is the starting point, building on it is the work, and the work goes on for as long as you're willing to do it. They went back to Granger Ranch in August, when Ellie was 3 weeks old, and Mabel had declared herself sufficiently recovered to travel, despite Caleb's privately expressed wish that they wait another week, and Dr. Purcell's publicly expressed suggestion of the same. "I want to go home," she said simply, and that ended the discussion. Thomas met them at the yard with an expression of fierce, barely suppressed excitement. He had been managing the ranch alongside Pete for 3 weeks with the focused seriousness of a child who has been given real responsibility and understands the weight of it. And when he saw the baby bundled in Mabel's arms, he went very still. She crouched down carefully and held Ellie so he could see her properly. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, considering eyes. Ellie looked back with the unfocused attention of a newborn who has not yet learned to look at anything in particular. "She's small," Thomas said. "She is. She'll get bigger?" "She will." He thought about this. "Okay," he said, and then he went to take the horses because he had understood there was work waiting, and he was not the kind of person who deferred work, which was, Mabel thought, the most clearly she had ever seen his father in him had it. Doris Marsh reviewed the Eastern 40 purchase agreement and declared it sound in early September, with 2 minor adjustments to the boundary description that Crow's people accepted without dispute. The water filing withdrawals were documented and filed, and Mabel had copies stored in 3 separate places because she was Mabel Whitmore, Mabel Granger, and she did not trust single copies of important documents. The sale closed on a Friday afternoon. Judge Alderman came through on his regular circuit, notarized the signatures, and drank the coffee Mabel brought him and told Caleb, somewhat ceremonially, that he was glad the water business was settled. "So am I," Caleb said. Harlan Crow signed without ceremony and left without anything that could be fairly called a concession, but also without the combativeness of their previous encounters. He was what he was. He would go on being what he was, somewhere else, with somebody else's land as the next objective. Mabel harbored no illusions about his transformation, but he was done with Granger Ranch and done with her, and in the specific terms of what she needed from him that was sufficient. The week after the sale closed, Mrs. Alderman organized what the town of Linden Creek called a social, and what was, in practice, a party in which Mabel was the unofficial guest of honor, something she had not requested and could not entirely prevent. The women of Linden Creek had opinions about the past year, about the water filings and the handled negotiations, and the fact that Granger Ranch had not only survived 6 years of Crow's pressure, but had ended it on its own terms. And those opinions wanted to be expressed in the form of covered dishes and too much coffee. She went. She sat in the alderman's front room with Ellie in her arms, and Thomas on the chair beside her, and Clara across the room, and Caleb at the edge of the gathering in the position he always occupied at social events, present but not fully at ease, which she no longer tried to fix because it was just how he was. And she accepted the expressions of regard from women who had whispered about the overweight bride a year ago, with a grace she mostly felt. Not entirely. There was a corner of her that would always find the irony of it pointed, the way her value had become legible to people only after she demonstrated it in terms they recognized. She understood this was not personal to Linden Creek or to Wyoming. It was the way most people worked. Worth without demonstration was invisible. She had spent 30 years being invisible in exactly this way, and now she wasn't, and she wasn't sure whether to be grateful for the recognition or tired of the fact that it had required this much. She decided, sitting in Mrs. Alderman's front room, that she could be both, tired of the system and glad to be on the other side of it. Those two things weren't mutually exclusive. She'd learned in the past year that most true things weren't simple. Ruth Haverford, the widow from the train, the woman who had asked if she was frightened and told her about her cousin Harriet in Colorado, had written to her in the spring after receiving a letter Mabel had sent her. She'd written back with updates about her own life, and closed the letter with a line that Mabel had read several times. "I think about our conversation on the train sometimes. You said you were more frightened of going back than going forward. I've been thinking about how that's the right kind of frightened to be. For most of us, for most of our lives. Come one evening in October, a year and a half after she'd stepped off the Linden Creek stage with road dust on her coat and her hair beyond saving, Mabel stood at the kitchen window in the early dark and held her daughter and listened to the house. Caleb was in the study with the account books, which she now reviewed with him on the first Sunday of every month, rather than keeping them separately. Thomas was upstairs, probably reading past the time he was supposed to be asleep, a habit she had never managed to eradicate, and had largely stopped trying to because she understood it as a version of her own self and couldn't find it in herself to punish that. Claire had gone back to Ohio in September, with a tentative promise to return in the spring that felt like it would keep. Their mother had written twice more. The letters were not easy letters to receive. They were the letters of a woman learning, late and imperfectly, how to say things she'd spent decades not saying. But they were honest, which was more than Mabel had expected, and she wrote back honestly in return, and the correspondence was building something slow and uncertain and not yet named, but present. Ellie made a small sound in her arms and Mabel shifted her automatically, the way her body had learned the adjustments of this particular weight. She thought about what her life had been a year and a half ago. The kitchen in Ohio, the secondhand trunk, the letter she hadn't sent and then had, the 40 minutes in a wagon with a man she hadn't planned on, learning whether she could read him. She thought about what people had expected of her, not just her family, though them, certainly, but the town of Linden Creek, who had watched a plus-size woman from Ohio arrive as a mail-order bride and had not expected much. Harlan Crow, who had looked at her and seen furniture. Even Caleb, early on, who had written a letter about a partner and had not yet understood what kind of partner she would actually be. The thing was, she didn't blame most of them. Not really. Not anymore. People look at what's in front of them and see the surface first because that's what surfaces are for, to be seen. What's underneath takes time to become visible. Her whole life she had been a surface people thought they understood, and she had spent that life knowing the surface wasn't the whole story and being unable to make anyone care about the rest. What she'd learned in Wyoming was not that it got easier to be underestimated. It didn't. It still landed the same way every time, the slight, the dismissal, the reflex to minimize her presence. What she'd learned was that the underestimating said nothing true about her. It said something true about the person doing it and the limits of what they were willing to see, and that was their problem to solve, not hers. She had stopped making herself smaller so other people could see the whole room. She had not stopped once, in 17 months, making herself smaller for anyone. Caleb appeared in this kitchen doorway, the way he did most evenings around this time, done with the books, looking for coffee or company or both. He looked at her at the window with Ellie, and he had the expression she'd come to know best on him, not the guarded, measured look of their early months, not the watchful fear of her pregnancy, but the settled, specific look of a man who has found his bearings and knows it. "Thomas is reading," he said. "I know. Past lights out. I know that too." He came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at Ellie, who had closed her eyes with the decisive confidence of a baby who has decided the current moment requires sleep. "Good day?" he asked. She thought about it. The morning had been cold and there was mud on the kitchen floor that had taken 3 attempts to fully clear. Ellie had been fussy in the afternoon for no reason she could identify. The north fence needed attention before the weather turned. She had a letter to Doris Marsh that needed finishing before Friday. "Yes," she said. "Good day." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it. And outside the October dark was complete, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind of stars you couldn't see from Ohio. Too many, too bright, unreasonably abundant. And the house was warm and full of the sounds of people she loved going about the work of being alive. She had not expected any of this. She had boarded a train west because she had nothing left to lose, and she had arrived somewhere she had not imagined, and she had built something out of stubbornness and ledger books, and the willingness to stay when it was hard. And the thing she'd built had turned out to be a life. Not a perfect one. There would be bad winters and difficult years, and the ongoing, imperfect work of being married to someone and raising children and managing land and navigating the world's persistent habit of looking at her and seeing less than she was. All of that would continue. She wasn't naive enough to think the story ended here at some resolved and triumphant point. But here was what she knew, standing at the window with her daughter in her arms and her husband beside her and the endless Wyoming sky full of stars. She was exactly who she had always been, The sisters had not made her. Hatchet Falls had not made her. The cruelty of being sent west as a joke had not made her. She had arrived here already herself, practical, stubborn, honest, uninterested in being smaller than she was. And this place and this man and this life had not changed her so much as given her room to be exactly that, without apology, for the first time. The woman nobody expected anything of had turned out to be the one nobody could stop. She suspected Thomas had said it best, on the day she told him about Ellie, when he'd looked at her with those dark, considering eyes and asked simply, "Does that mean you're staying?" She had said yes. She would keep saying yes. That was all there was to it, and that was enough.